Welcome everyone. Hope everyone's staying safe out there with this pandemic going on. Obviously the webinar is the right best communication form to use in this type of situation. So again, welcome. And I'm going to be talking today about KPI number 6, but just some preliminary information about KPIs and what they are. Key performance indicators, a scorecard completed each month, taking the plant's pulse on maintenance effectiveness. And as Lord Calvin says it there, when you can measure what you're speaking about and express it in numbers, you know something about it. But when you cannot measure it, when you cannot express it in numbers, your knowledge is unsatisfactory. And at that point, if we don't have data, then it's mostly an emotional discussion versus a fact-based, data-driven discussion. So KPIs are very important part of measurement of maintenance performance. So KPIs, just real quickly, they're not a measure of individuals, but a quantitative measure of the process. So if an organization isn't meeting those expected targets, the process needs to be addressed, evaluated, and corrections made. And the KPI in and of itself it really just raises that red flag to tell you something isn't in line with our expectations or our goals or our targets. And the further analysis evaluation needs to be conducted utilizing other KPIs as well as your work order history within your CMMS software can give you a lot of good information and data to determine root cause of that off-target performance. So a quick recap of the 11 KPIs that I recommend. These are all very important, and I've kind of settled on these over the years as being a very effective set of KPIs to have in your toolbox in your performance measurement process. So in previous webinars, as Chad mentioned, this is a series, so we're sequentially going through these KPIs, giving you more detail and understanding how to calculate those, how to interpret those, and how to improve those. And in the previous webinars that we have covered those first 5 KPIs, which are CMS and payroll hours, maintenance effort hour usage, the ratio of PM to PDM inspections to corrective work orders, PM compliance, total schedule compliance, and now this month our focus is on work order backlog, which is a very important KPI, not often utilized effectively, and I think it's one of the most misinterpreted or improperly calculated KPIs out there. But to me, again, an essential KPI if you truly have the desire to transition from a reactive environment into a proactive environment. This is a measurement that is essential. So let's take a closer look at it. What is backlog? Work order backlog is the number of weeks of labor required to complete all work orders in the CMMS. So you'll notice I bolded the word weeks. So we measure backlog in number of weeks, and I'll get into that detail of how we determine the number of weeks and how we calculate that. Backlog's based on actual hours available for backlog relief. Now here the key is actual hours available. So how many hours do you truly have available to do backlog work orders on a daily or weekly basis? I think you'll be surprised once we get into the calculation of how that number may shape out. Backlog weeks is determined by doing an available labor calculation. So that's another critical step, is to do a calculation to determine what is the total hours I have on average week to week to relieve backlog. And then you also must extract the data and information to determine how much backlog you actually have in labor hours from your CMMS. So is backlog good or bad? Well, I kind of view it as I could call it kind of a Goldilocks KPI, where it can be bad if it's in either extreme, but if you're hitting the target kind of right in the middle there, it's very good. It's a very good measurement to help drive your proactive process, and I'll explain more about that. The key part is maintenance is managed by managing the backlog. So this backlog is important to be able to proactively schedule work, to make sure it's properly planned, and to take your department out of that reactive state. So what is our goal for backlog, work order backlog? So I like to measure it in two different ways. So the first way I measure it is defined as ready backlog. This includes any work that is ready to be scheduled. So what does ready mean? Well, ready means that it has been fully planned, that all of the job steps have been defined, that you have all the parts defined and pre-kitted, you've determined any special tools or skills or crafts, and you've put a good, reasonable job estimate on that job. So everything about the what and how has been determined. You just need to find the opportunity of who and when to get the job done in coordination with the rest of your operation, whether that be production or other functional departments. So um, that's the way I define a ready job. So really important to know how much ready work do you have. So that means I can fully deploy my technicians on this ready work and keep them busy on productive, well-planned jobs in an efficient manner throughout the week. Our goal for ready backlog is 2 to 4 weeks. So we actually want to have 2 to 4 weeks. Now, I've seen some, people believe, and even in publications, that we don't want any backlog. We want to have all the work done and completed. And if we have zero backlog, that means we're doing great. Well, I would say, contrary to that, that is not where you want to be. And hopefully, as we get through this presentation, you'll understand why. The other way I like to measure this is in total. So total backlog. So I've got my ready backlog that's ready to schedule, and then the total backlog, which includes everything, all work that's on hold, whether it's waiting on parts, waiting for approvals, waiting for funding, whatever it is. Any job that has been identified and submitted as a work request is going to go into my backlog as part of that workload that needs to be managed and reduced with my labor resources. So let's explain backlog. What is backlog? Why is it important, and how do we manage it? So the best way I found to describe it is using kind of this funnel analogy. So if we look at this funnel, we can see that at the top we have the input into the funnel, which would be your work request, right? Either submitted from other departments, whether coming in as a corrective off of a PM, or a variety of other reasons. So that's all the incoming work that's coming into the department that's been identified as maintenance work that needs to be completed. Obviously, some of that work will be higher priority than others, but it's all going to go into this backlog. And if we move down the funnel there into what I call the reservoir area, the backlog. So that's what I'm calling total backlog. Everything that needs to get done that isn't, the work has been identified and hopefully in the CMMS to be completed. The next step down, we look at, if we call that the neck of the funnel, or the output of the funnel. You can see that that neck, I would define that as the capacity or direct labor hours you have available to do that, and then the output is the work that gets done. Okay, so work's coming in, work's going out, and we need to try to manage that at a relatively consistent level to ensure that we've got enough work to keep everybody busy on proactive activities, but also not let the funnel overflow, right? Because then our jobs are getting way outdated and they're getting out of control to be done in a timely manner. So the output, obviously, we want to be coming out relatively consistent with the input going in. So we have to manage that through our capacity. And if you look at that neck of the funnel, if we want to change, as the flow coming in is bigger, we have to change the width of that neck, right? So that increases our ability or direct labor hours to do the backlog and to complete the jobs. So resources must be balanced with workload, or you cannot transition from reactive to proactive maintenance. So that's the key message there. How do we calculate backlog? So we look at the ready component, relatively simple calculations here. We look at estimated labor hours on all work orders with a status of ready or open. Now, depending on your CMMS, you may be using other status identifiers, but it's really all those jobs that are ready to be scheduled or have already been started but still have a some level of work to be completed and it needs to be scheduled at a future time. Maybe they started a job and didn't have all the parts, and now they have the parts, but it's it's open but needs to be completed. So those types of things. And you divide that by your total hours available for backlog relief. Now that's the key. That defining that number accurately is the critical part, and I'll go through that. When we look at total, it's basically everything that's in the ready and open. Okay, so it includes, ready is a subset of the total, but it also includes everything that's on hold. Everything that's on hold that needs to be approved, or is waiting on those parts, or any of those other jobs that still are expected to get done. We just can't schedule them yet because of various reasons of planning, typically. Okay, and you divide that, of course, by the same denominator. So how do we get the right data for this calculation? That's, to me, is the key, and that's sometimes can be challenging for plants to establish the right data to ensure accurate calculation here. So one of the key things is to make sure that all your work requests are entered in your CMMS and captured as work orders. Okay, so all the work that needs to get done. If you're trying to manage from honeydew lists and handwritten paper notes and things of that nature, obviously your backlog and your CMS and your data is going to be incomplete, and it'll be very difficult to get an accurate number. Another key factor is ensure every work order has an accurate estimate labor craft hours. Whatever that initial labor estimate, some CMMSs call it labor estimate, others like MVP Plant call it a craft labor estimate, craft hours. Whatever that is, every work order in the backlog must have this craft hour estimate assigned to it, so that we can totalize that to determine that total workload. It doesn't do enough to say I've got 100 work orders in my backlog. I mean, that could vary widely if some of those jobs, or most of those jobs, are 30-minute jobs versus a high percentage being 4 or 5 hour jobs. So we need to understand that in hours. Another important step is to verify that the status designations are updated and correct on all the jobs in that backlog. So you put it in the right bucket, so you know it's whether it's ready, whether it's total, because you're going to make different decisions on whether it's part of your total backlog or your ready backlog, and how you manage that and deal with it. And then run a report from your CMMS that gives you a total estimated craft hours grouped by work order status. So that's a standard report in most every CMMS to get a work order report. In MVP Plant, it's the work order report under the list in the work category. So very easy to find. You just need to apply the right filters and run that report to get a total for the estimated labor hours. And then the other key part is you've got to conduct an available labor calculation worksheet to get an accurate number of labor hours available to relieve that backlog. And I'll go through that with you very briefly, just to kind of show you how I do it. So it's very simple Excel type format that you can emulate. So looking at the report, the first key piece of data, as I mentioned, this is a very simplified sample out of MVP Plant, and as you can see, the key fields that you want to get out of here are the fields of estimated craft hours, right? So you want to make sure you include that estimated craft hours that you'll total up. And obviously, if you see any zeros when you run that report, you know you don't have estimates on all your work orders. So I would correct that first. And then, and obviously, this is a big number. This is a multiple page report. I just condensed it down to one page so I could put it on a slide, but you can see 1,788 and a half hours is what my total backlog is. Then you take that same data, and by status, right, you would extract the ready work orders or jobs to define your ready work. So your ready, or as MVP calls it, in process, would be the open jobs. Okay. So that's what a standard report, again, whatever CMMS you're using, I'm sure has similar capability to extract this type of data and information. Then we get into the calculation of how do you determine how many hours you have available to relieve backlog. So I'm going to show you just the simple form I use, very basic in Excel. And so if I look at this spreadsheet that I'm showing you here, you can see that that I've put in, I just put in a simple number for my crew size, and each guy working 40 hours, it calculates how many hours per week I have. And I am authorized in this particular sample or example or targeting to have a 10% overtime number. So roughly 32 hours a week of overtime is what I typically incur or schedule to. And so that gives me, as you can see here, 352 hours of labor that I'm paying for, that's available. So if I look at the bottom here, you take those numbers from your report and plug them in here. You see the 1788.5 from that sample report I showed you. And then it calculates out what is my ready backlog and what is my total backlog. As you can see, heck, with the labor hours I have, that looks pretty good, right? Remember, our target is 2 and 4 for ready, 4 to 8 for total. So, if I just use my base labor available calculation or numbers, I'm looking pretty good. But that's not accurate. That'll be very misleading if you use that type of calculation. So you can see the next section there is those indirect commitments. So if I go to the next section here and look at my indirect commitments from weekly averages, if you're paying for lunch, that's part of your paid hours or probably part of that 8 hours per day. You would deduct those, but in this case, I'm not paying for lunch. Put in an average for your vacations, absences, training, meetings per week. So you have all these, and you may add some different ones as well, depending on your operation, but these would be some typical ones that I would put in my calculation. And now, when I subtract those, you can see I only have 288 hours available, all right? Coming back down to my backlog numbers, my ready and total, you can see now I'm at 1.8 and 6.2. Okay, actually still pretty good as far as my target goes. So I'm doing okay with that one. But now let's take the next section, which is other commitments. These are hours that we know that guys get consumed by every week, right? We all have those urgent emergency hours. We all want to make sure we're doing our PMs, right? Those need to be automatically deducted. They cannot relieve backlog because they're going to be consumed by those PM activities. So if we look at the next slide, and I've added those in here, which in this particular case, I'm running about 30% urgent work. So that's got to be taken into consideration when you determine your backlog hours. If I look at my average PMs, it's 84 hours average a week. And what I would typically do with this, I would take an actual average of your last 6 months, 6 weeks of work orders to determine and just average it out by the number of weeks and come up with a general average. It doesn't have to be exact. We just want a reasonable deduct for those activities. Now, when I look at my ready and total backlog, you can see in reality, I am way out of control, and it's heavily driven obviously by this urgent work, okay? But we have to realize that, we have to recognize that that urgent work is there. And obviously, as we continue to reduce that and become more proactive, with the same number of resources, I can get my backlog in a more manageable state. Okay, so I just wanted to go through that. Again, a simple calculation. Like I say, quite often underestimated and done incorrectly that can skew your numbers and make you think that you're in much better shape than you really are. So let's look at our backlog. What does it tell me? So when I get this KPI and I do the calculation, if I have low backlog, the first thing I think of, we may have more resources than we truly need. If I don't have enough jobs to keep the guys fully scheduled and busy week, day in and day out, week to week, that could be the cause. And sometimes, as you transition out of a very reactive state, the reality may be you may not need as many resources as you once had. So that's one thing to consider. The other thing could be operation is functioning in a highly reactive mode, and problems are being addressed through emergency line calls instead of work requests. Okay, so what does that mean? That means that work orders aren't coming into your funnel, right? You're not getting the work in there to be proactively planned and scheduled. So if that's the case, need to address that through other means and get compliance with the work order policy across the site. Get the work orders in there, make sure we're capturing correctives and so forth. If the total is low and work requests, it could mean work requests aren't being entered into the CMMS. Okay, so that's kind of what I just alluded to. If ready is low and total is high, there may not be enough planning capacity. So if you don't have enough jobs ready to go, but you've got a big backlog in total, that just means that we're not don't have the capacity to properly plan and schedule plan those jobs to get them ready to schedule. So that's something to consider in that scenario. What if it's high? What if I have a high backlog? Well, there may not be enough total resources to keep it in control. That's quite often where you may need to look at maybe we need more technicians, and maybe we need to authorize some overtime or do some other things to get this thing back into control. Or it could be just not enough resources available on certain shifts. I've seen that quite often, is that when the equipment's available to do the jobs, some of the jobs that are in the backlog, we just don't have enough resources. And quite often in some manufacturing environments, that could be on Sunday night or on the weekends where many operations don't have the bulk of the resources. You've got to consider that. There may be a need to possibly shift resources or provide some overtime to be able to get that backlog in control. If ready backlog's high and total is in control, jobs aren't getting scheduled and completed. So if you got a lot of ready work, is everyone getting fully scheduled, and is supervision making sure that that schedule gets efficiently executed on a weekly basis? And then the operation may not be giving adequate equipment access to complete the jobs in the backlog. So you may have an excess of jobs that require downtime, but production's never given you the time to do it. Okay, so that's another way. If you can define that magnitude, then we can address that and the urgency of those jobs with operations, hopefully coordinate some time and availability and access to the equipment. Okay, so just kind of quickly again, there's 3 ways to get that backlog down if it's really high. The first one I mentioned is existing maintenance crew overtime. So you can take your existing crew, authorize some overtime. This should be the first and easiest option, right? Especially if you've just had a spike, kind of a temporary spike. Maybe you just had an audit done or something like that, and it created this whole influx of work requests. So that could be a scenario where overtime could help alleviate that. A second option I would use would be contracted labor to get specific jobs completed. So if you have a group of maybe larger electrical jobs, running conduit, running wires, installing a panel or something of that nature, definitely some good jobs that potentially a contractor could do for you and get completed accurately and quickly. So that's to me would be the second choice to relieve that backlog. The third choice, and usually the least preferred, is adding headcount. Adding labor resources to the maintenance department. At times, it's the necessary approach, but it should be the last option only when the backlog continues to grow, even when you've deployed the first 2 options and you can't get it back down or under control. Or the other thing is the financial impact of bringing all these contractors in is exceeding the cost of adding that headcount, and it makes sense to do that. So those are the 3 ways to get that backlog back down and in control. And so I want to just cover off on a few tips to improve your backlog management. So one thing is, again, make sure you're getting jobs properly planned and scheduled in a timely manner. So that's obviously a critical element. If my ready backlog is high and I'm not scheduling everyone fully, I would focus on that first and try to execute that way. So got to do the planning and scheduling piece to relieve that backlog. Labor craft estimates must be on every work order, as I mentioned earlier. That's one of the first things I would go check before you try to run a backlog calculation, is verify, run that report and make sure there's no zeros on estimated labor craft hours. Do not keep a backlog in the work request module. I see this happen quite often as well. Don't try to manage backlog in the request module as well as in the work order module. It'll become very difficult to try to do the estimates, try to look at both modules, try to compile the information. I recommend that every work request gets processed one way or another within 72 hours. Either it gets turned into a work order and maybe put on hold for other approvals, or it gets rejected and sent back, to the originator as something we're not going to do, either because it's a duplicate or because it's it needs to be a capital project or whatever direction it needs to take. So don't try to manage your backlog in the request module as well as in the work order module. And then implement a work order policy for plant-wide work requests. If you're not getting that influx, that incoming work requests into your system, that's one way to try to build up your backlog so you can plan and schedule proactive, efficient work for your technicians and keep them busy on a day-to-day basis. And then run those detailed work order reports. Look into the details of your backlog to determine what types of work is it. Is it a particular type, or is it a particular location in the plant or a particular line that's causing my backlog to grow? And so you can narrow the focus to start attacking those particular specific issues that are driving your backlog in the wrong direction. And so the other thing I always mention is make sure you're trending the data. You always need to trend the data and keep it updated. Look at it over time to ensure that it's moving in the right direction. And in particular for the backlog information, if you see a kind of anomaly or a spike here and there, that can be managed, that can be controlled through contractors or with overtime. But if you see the trend continually increasing, that's when you need to determine other actions that should be taken to try to get it under control before it gets so out of control that it's impacting the plant and reliability, and things are just getting lost and not getting done in a reasonable time frame. So always trend your KPIs, always take a look at them and look at them over time to ensure you're moving in the right direction. And then, of course, make sure that you are compiling these with the rest of your KPIs, looking in them holistically to help make the right business decisions for the maintenance department as well as the plant in general to ensure we're improving and delivering reliability to the operation. So backlog is a critical KPI. I highly recommend all of you make an attempt at trying to calculate this, and hopefully this guidance that I've covered here will give you some good direction to get a good, accurate backlog calculation in your department and with your CMMS. Okay. So with that, I want to just touch upon a little bit of the reliability services. If you need or in need of further help with KPIs or with any other kind of evaluations, assessments, or data collection, PM optimization, there's a whole host of services that we can help out with if you find that you don't have the internal resources to do things and get them completed in a timely manner. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Chad to manage the question and answer session. Chad?
All right, thanks, Bill. Just as a final note too on the last slide, we do have a handout to those reliability flyer, or the reliability training and services flyer that's listed in the handout section there. And I also posted the link to the web page that has those details in the chat box as well. And since we are up on time here, we're going to forego the Q&A portion of this in the interest of everyone's time, but we do have a log of everyone's questions that they've asked, and we will be following up with you all separately on that. If you do find that you have any additional questions after the fact, you can also use the contact information on the screen there to get a hold of us, or of course you can always reach out to your dedicated account executive as well. So again, we'd just like to thank everyone for your time today. We appreciate you attending. And like I said, if you have any additional questions, please make use of the contact information there on the screen and we'll be happy to help you out. So thank you again for attending, And here's to maintenance and reliability success.